Hi, this is Corey Johnston, and today's lesson is going to come from the 7th chapter in the book of Zechariah. Herein we learn of the order of spiritual priorities, but before we get to that, we just want to give a little brief background information. Zechariah was Babylonian-born exile generation. He went with the wave when Cyrus issued the decree of 538. He returned with them, and he was contemporaries with the prophet Haggai but Haggai's ministry spans about 4 months. 4 months. Zechariah spans some 40 years, but he was with him in the beginning. The greatest concern was the reconstruction of the temple. There had been a 16-year hiatus, and there was all these foreign forces aligned against the reconstructors of the temple. We can read of these in Nehemiah and Ezra. But in the 7th chapter, the one we'll be covering today, marks a distinct literary transition. What we read in the 6 chapters which come before it are visionaries. There's 8 visions in these 6 chapters. They all have visionary components. There are 2 categories of revelation: a vision, which stimulates the organ of the eye, the sense of sight, in which the prophet beholds a vision of historical significance of a yet-to-be-fulfilled event. And there is also an audio, a message. In this one, there's no element of vision. It's all audio. And if Haggai's emphasis was the physical reconstruction and the motivation to get the temple done, Zechariah attends more to the spiritual elements, and he also has far-sighted prophecies, messianic allusions, and apocalyptic visions, which take place in chapters 9 through 14. So he kept on writing. The 9 through 14 aren't dated, but we do have a precise chronological date in the 7th chapter, which is historically useful. We'll get to that when we get to that. We just want to briefly cover what takes place in the chapter before it. Here, and we witness 4 chariots, a red horse, black horse, white horse, and a strong speckled horse, which more or less corresponds to the horses of which we read, not presented in the same order, but in Revelation 6. I recently did one on that, and it's a pale horse in that one, and I think it's the order they're presented then is white, red, black, pale. But these are the 4 spirits of the heavens coming forth from presenting themselves before the master of all the earth. So these are divinely sent, whereas those in Revelation we can accurately infer are demonic in orange. And he said that they're scattered to the 4 directions of the earth. There's 4 of them. And he called to me and spoke to me and said, "See, those who go towards the land of the north have given rest to my spirit in the land of the north." Babylon, the one who had recently overwhelmed and conquered and subjugated and exiled the Judeans, was the nation to the north where the Spirit had rest. And then also in the same chapter, this could be arguably mark the revolution of the audio component, which more officially begins in the 7th chapter, because "and the word of Yahweh came to me saying." And this message pertains to the crowning of Joshua, the high priest. And he calls it the man whose name is the branch, and from his place he shall branch out, and he shall build the temple of Yahweh. So temple will be built. It's completed around the year 516, 515, 2 or 3 years after the chapter we'll be covering today, and it is declared and decreed in the word of Yahweh. That means it's going to happen. It is he who is going to build the temple of Yahweh. It is he who is going to bear the splendor, and he shall sit and rule on the throne, and shall be a priest on his throne, and the counsel of the peace shall be between them both. So the he in this we may have misspoken earlier. This is a messianic portend and allusion, because the capital is the H in the he is capitalized, indicative of divinity, and he is the branch of David, and he is the temple. His body is the temple, and we are temples of the Ruach Kodesh. In Christianity, we don't have temples, and Judaism hasn't had one since the year 70 A.D., but the closing verse of the preceding chapter reads, "And those who are far away shall come and build the temple of Yahweh, and you shall know that Yahweh of hosts has sent me to you, and this shall be if you diligently obey the voice of Yahweh your Elohim." So what he says will come to pass, will eventually and inevitably come to pass, but to diligently obey, it goes above and beyond the mandatory minimum of obedience. It's really a strenuous effort, and to obey, the issuing of commandments is done precisely because they are hard to ask, and so it does take a diligence and strenuous to obey the voice of Yahweh, your Elohim, but we are immeasurably blessed for having done so, and the Word speaks to us in the Bible itself. So the opening verse of the 7th chapter, the one we'll be covering, this marks the beginning of the official lesson itself. In the 4th year of King Darius, it came to be that the word of Yahweh came to Zechariah on the 4th of the 9th month, Kislev. So this year is the 4th year of Darius. He was the successor of Cambyses, the son of Cyrus, the one who had really got the momentum going on the Persian Empire. And he was related, I think he was a nephew of the original Persian Emperor Cyrus. And the Hebrew, the 9th month corresponds to December 7th, that's the date of this. So this takes 2 years after the visions described in the previous 6 chapters. So we do have that chronologically precise dating. And the word comes to the month of Kislev. Now, the Hebrew calendar overlaps with our months, so there's a lot of confusion there. We just want to focus on the fact that the word of Yahweh came to Zechariah, and when the word comes, one has no choice. It's an irresistible force to speak the word once it comes. Now Bethel had sent Sar-Estar with Regem-Melech and his men to pray before Yahweh. Bethel was the center of Jeroboam, the original king of northern Israel's idolatrous centers. He constructed them at Bethel. It does have some significance dating back to the patriarchs, but beginning with Jeroboam, the original king of the northern kingdom of Israel, it had a distinctly idolatrous connotation. But these two men, what do they say? Speaking to the priest who belonged to the house of Yahweh of hosts, and to the prophet, saying, should I weep in the 5th month and fast as I have done for so many years? So it also bears mention that Zechariah, like Jeremiah and Ezekiel, was a priest and a prophet. Most of the prophets were called outside the priestly caste and were largely sent to, some of them were sent to indict the spiritual laxity and the moral laxity of the priests who were entrusted to instruct and inform the covenant nation of their covenantal duties. But Zechariah was a priest and a prophet. He is descended from, I think, says in the first verse, son of Berechiah, son of Iddo. Iddo is mentioned in the first chapter. That comes from Iddo is mentioned in Nehemiah, so he is along that wave. And the fast, there were certain fasts that the post-exilic generations had imposed on themselves in reference to the fact of their exile. So the first of them took place in their 10th month of the year. This was when the Babylonian siege began. It was a 2-year siege which completed its purpose. And in the 4th month of, not the year that it began, but perhaps the one or two after, the city walls were breached, and in the 5th month of the Hebrew calendar, the temple was brazed and burned to the ground. The 5th month overlaps with July and August, and in the 7th month, the assassination of Gedaliah, we can read of this in Jeremiah 41. He was the original governor of Judah. He was assassinated. And so for each of these events, the Jews took it upon themselves to fast in remembrance of the occasion. And I think Zechariah's name incidentally translates as Yahweh remembers. So pretty much all of the prophets, they have one of two suffixes at their name. Indicative of Yahweh, that's the covenant name, or El, that's the broader scope of Elohim. That's what he is. Yahweh is who he is. Then the word of Yahweh of hosts came to me, saying, now the answer to their question he does not provide until chapter 8, verse 19. That's outside the range we'll be covering today, but he really speaks to the priorities that they are missing. So he does not give an immediate answer to the question, but he tells them, speak to all the peoples of the land and to the priests, saying, when you fasted and lamented in the 5th and 7th months, in all these 70 years, did you truly fast for me for me. So the 5th and 7th month were two of the occasions. Remember, the temple was razed and Gedaliah was assassinated. But he's questioning, he's speaking through the mouthpiece of remember, the word of Yahweh came to me. That's a self-reference to the author of this book, Zechariah. And what he's telling them is, he's asking them, did you really do it all for me? Was it really for me? Because this was a tradition of their own making. There was nothing scriptural in it. So the question was, now that the new temple was going to be reconstructed in a matter of time, and perhaps was in the process of underway, you remember, it would be 515, 516, 2 or 3 years after the events that transpired in this chapter when it would be completed. So the question was, did they still need to fast? And he's answering their question with another question: did you fast for me? So it is entirely possible to exercise spiritual practices and disciplines with ulterior and selfish motives. We read of this, such as one of the three hypocritical spiritual practices that the Master himself indicts in Matthew 6 is the practice of fasting. The hypocrites, they like to exaggerate their physical degradation and let everyone know. They announce that they are fasting, whereas the correct way of doing it is to do it piously and humbly, to let no one know that you are fasting. And also from the Old Testament, Isaiah 58 speaks of the meaninglessness, the potential meaninglessness of fasting, and he says, this is the fast that I want, and gives them the weightier, more important matters of the law. So the Pharisees, to bring it back to the New Testament, they were prolific fasters. They fasted twice a week. I think Mondays and Thursdays were the days in which they fasted, but they neglected the weightier matters. And when you ate and when you drank, was it not for those eating and for those drinking? So everything we do has to be to the glory and grandeur and splendor and majesty of our Maker. So when we eat, we are to pray before we eat. We are to pray after we eat. It is impossible to eat the food without concern or consideration for the Creator who provides it. Yahweh Yireh is the name that speaks of Yahweh's provision capabilities. So every food that he gives is that we eat is really a blessing from him, and it's possible to eat those only for the company around them and for yourself, and not have any mind or motive to bless or thank Yahweh. Are these not the words which Yahweh proclaimed through the former prophets, when Jerusalem and the cities in it were inhabited, and in safety, and in the south and the low country were inhabited? So the nation of Israel and Judah had a long storied tradition of prophets, beginning with Samuel all the way to Malachi. He's almost a century after Zechariah. But Zechariah is once more the same generation as Haggai. And so they had this unending continuum of prophets who preached the same thing. They were covenant enforcers, largely because the priestly caste were derelict in this duty. So Yahweh, in his mercy, he doesn't issue judgment without warning, and he given them ample warning. So they were without excuse for finding themselves in the predicament they were in. They had sinned away their day of grace through repeated, societal-wide, egregious violations of the terms of the covenant. And these prophets, they were there when they were in prosperity, warning them that it was the autumn before the winter of judgment. And now they find themselves, remember, Zechariah was a Babylonian-born transplant who found his way back to his native land after being in the exile. And the word of Yahweh came to Zechariah, saying, so here, for curious reasons, in the 4th verse we read, come to me. So that's a self-reference. Here he refers to himself in the third person. Zechariah is the author of the book which bears his name. Although there is some scholarly contention beginning in, they speak of Deutero, Zechariah, and beginning in the 9th chapter, and that goes to the whole double author theory. We don't personally endorse any double author theory. There's one for a lot of books. Isaiah, the Deutero Isaiah begins allegedly in the 40th chapter. Thus said Yahweh of hosts, judge true, right justice, show kindness and mercy everyone to his brother. So these are the weightier matters of the law that they were neglecting. They thought they were doing Yahweh a service in fasting, but they were actually, in actual fact, doing it for themselves implicitly from the question. So whenever Yahweh asks a question, it is never because he lacks information. It is always to test the response of the one who is questioned. So the question we read of in the 5th verse, and then we restore the priorities. This is the fasting that Isaiah said he really wants. This is a form of true worship and true principles and true virtues. Those are justice, kindness, and mercy, everyone to his brother. So there is no scope or limitation to those these qualities that we should show to our brethren. Do not oppress the widow, or the fatherless, the stranger, or the poor, and do not plot evil in your hearts against one another. So Yahweh's law and the Mosaic law, Moses was not the author of the law which bears his name, he was the mere intermediary, always expresses Yahweh's concern for the vulnerable of society, the oppressed, the widow, the foreigner, and the orphan, and these are people who tend to be overlooked and neglected by society at large, but they are treasured in the hearts of the Father, who has a special concern, and they have a powerful ally in their defense at the day of judgment, and we will have to answer. The more advantaged and privileged people will have to answer for what they did to better the situation and improve the lives of those who are not similarly privileged or advantaged. And do not plot evil in your heart. So evil begins with thinking. Actions don't come out of nowhere. There's a thought process, and it begins with meditating, plotting evil in your hearts. And it seems in our day and age that people are sitting down and devising new ways to do evil, new ways to hate, new ways to do violence, new ways for sex perversion. We clearly have this problem in our times, so there's a conspiratorial element in the evil which is making its way all across the world in the United States of America right now. But they refuse to listen, and they shrug their shoulders and stop their ears from hearing. So there's an element of willingness and conscious, deliberate choice. They refused to listen. They had the word, but it went in one ear and out the other because they refused to take it seriously. They treated trivially that which they should have treated significantly. The word of Yahweh is not just any word. It is the word, capital T-H-E. And, they neglected it. They shrugged their shoulders. What is that to me? Who cares, at all, etc. And they stop their ears from hearing, so eventually they just shut it out completely, and, that there comes a time, it is possible for people to hear the good news, and they used to weep, and it used to prick their conscience, and now they can just hear it. They've been dulled through lack of spiritual stimuli to tune in the message. They can turn it off and off just like that, and that was true in Zechariah's day, and it is true in our own. And they made their hearts like flint against hearing the law and the words which Yahweh of hosts had sent by his Spirit through the former prophets. Therefore great wrath came from Yahweh of hosts. So they had no one to blame but themselves for the wrath which was inflicted, which was entirely righteous. And they closed their hearts and their mind to listening and hearing and heeding the law of Moses, the Torah, and the words of the prophets, which were consistent and aligned with the law of Moses. You will never hear a prophecy that deviates from the law of Moses or the terms of the covenant. Such would have been tantamount to heresy. That's why you never find any prophet that contradicts anything in the Mosaic covenant. This is foundational to the message of the prophets in the Old Testament. And their wrath and retribution, they earned it, they deserved it. He is long-suffering, and he's certainly long-suffering to those he calls his own, but there comes a day when you have sinned away the day of grace, and judgment will and must come. So they were in Babylon for a reason, and now they were in the business of restoration, getting the nation rebuilt in the temple. And it came to pass, as he called and they did not hear, so let them call, but I shall not hear, says Yahweh of hosts. So the reciprocal consequences of closing your ears to Yahweh's word is that you do not have the access to him in prayer. The prophet Isaiah in 59 verse 2 says, our iniquity creates the chasm, and the fact is that God spurns the prayers of the wicked. We can read of this in such passages as John 9:31, and also several in the book of Proverbs, which say the sacrifice of the wicked is just invalid in their prayer too. And John 9:31 is that Elohim heareth not sinners, but those who are doing the work and the will of him. So we are not entitled, we are not entitled to have access to his ear when we shut our ears to him, because prayer is a dialogue and a conversation, and his word ought to shape our word to him. We have to measure our will. The purpose of prayer is not to dictate our selfish desires, but to ask for the discernment to know, the courage to enact, and the will, for the will of the Father, and the courage to do. And I scattered them with a storm wind all among the Gentiles, which they had not known, and their land was laid waste behind them, no one passing through or returning, for they made the pleasant land a waste. So because they had neglected their duty to treat the stranger in their midst, that we read of in verse 10, they themselves found themselves in a similar situation to those who had neglected in their midst. They were strangers in a foreign land among Gentiles who they had not known. They were scattered in the whirlwind, that is indicative of judgment. So they were there because they deserved to be there. And the land was left waste because the entire nation, except the most miserably poor, were all transplanted en masse to Babylon. And so it was essentially a ghost land and not a travel destination, but it was once a pleasant land. It was a land of milk and honey. There is literally no country like Israel on earth, but it had been reduced to a waste because of the terms of the covenant, which they were without excuse for ignoring. And that's all the time we have for today. Thank you so much. I'm so glad you're here. Stay tuned until next time. I'll see you then. Bye-bye.